The grand library of Bursa hummed with the quiet whispers of turning pages. Sunlight streamed through the high, arched windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Towering shelves stretched towards the vaulted ceiling, crammed with scrolls and books bound in leather and silk. Scholars in flowing robes paced the aisles, their fingers tracing the spines of ancient texts. Among them, a young woman moved with quiet grace. Her name was Daria, and she was a servant of the library, tasked with dusting shelves and fetching books for the learned men who frequented its hallowed halls. Daria was 24 years old, with eyes the color of the Aegean Sea and hair as dark as the midnight sky. Though her hands were calloused from labor, her mind was sharp and agile, fluent in 6 languages, each one a key unlocking a different world of knowledge. Daria loved the library. She loved the smell of old parchment and the rustle of silk. She loved the weight of a heavy tome in her hands and the secrets held within its pages. More than anything, Daria loved the words themselves, the way they could transport her to distant lands and times long past. She dreamt of being more than a servant, more than a mere fetcher of books. She dreamt of being a scholar herself, of deciphering ancient scripts and sharing their wisdom with the world. But her humble beginnings and the constraints of her position held her back. She was a woman in a world ruled by men, and the path to scholarship was a steep and treacherous one. Still, Daria persisted. Whenever she had a spare moment, she would sneak a peek at the book she was meant to dust, committing passages to memory. She listened intently to the scholars' debates, absorbing their knowledge like a sponge. She practiced her languages in hushed whispers, reciting poetry to the silent stacks. The library, with all its secrets and whispers, was her classroom, her sanctuary, and her hope. Prince Bashir strode into the library, his entourage trailing behind him like a flock of brightly colored birds. His crimson robe, embroidered with threads of gold, swirled around him as he moved. He was a young man, barely older than Daria, but he carried himself with an air of supreme confidence, his chin held high, his dark eyes scanning the room as if searching for a worthy opponent. Bashir was renowned throughout Bursa, not for his royal blood, but for his sharp intellect and his mastery of languages. He was a linguist of exceptional talent, able to decipher scripts that had baffled scholars for centuries. He was also, unfortunately, known for his arrogance. He delighted in challenging others to intellectual duels, often humiliating those who dared to match wits with him. Today, Prince Bashir had brought with him a small, intricately carved wooden box. He held it aloft, its polished surface gleaming in the sunlight. "Behold," he announced, his voice ringing through the hushed library, "a relic from a forgotten kingdom, bearing an inscription that has stumped the wisest scholars in the land." He opened the box, revealing a small clay tablet covered in strange symbols. "I challenge any of you," he declared, a smirk playing on his lips, "to translate these markings. If you succeed, you will earn my respect and a reward befitting your intellect." Several scholars stepped forward, eager to impress the prince. They peered at the tablet, their brows furrowed in concentration. One by one, they shook their heads, admitting defeat. The symbols were unlike anything they had ever encountered. Bashir chuckled, his amusement bordering on disdain. "It seems our esteemed scholars are at a loss," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Perhaps this ancient tongue is simply too complex for modern minds to grasp." He then proceeded to pronounce a word from the inscription, but his pronunciation was slightly off, a subtle misplacement of emphasis that changed the meaning entirely. Daria, who had been quietly dusting a nearby shelf, couldn't help herself. "Your Highness," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I believe the correct pronunciation is—" And she softly corrected him, her tongue shaping the unfamiliar sounds with precision. Bashir turned, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the servant girl who dared to correct him. Amused by her audacity, he held the tablet towards her. "So, little scribe," he mocked, "you think you know better than the scholars of Bursa? Very well. Translate this, and you'll be my wife." The words hung in the air, a mixture of challenge and jest. The scholars gasped, some stifling laughter. Daria's heart pounded in her chest, a mixture of fear and excitement coursing through her veins. She looked at the tablet, at the strange symbols that held a forgotten language, and then back at the prince, his dark eyes fixed on her. She took a deep breath and accepted the challenge. Daria's hand trembled slightly as she took the clay tablet from Prince Bashir. The weight of it felt surprisingly heavy, as if the secrets it held were pressing down on her. The scholars watched in stunned silence, their whispers fading into the background hum of the library. Bashir leaned against a nearby bookshelf, his arms crossed, a skeptical smile playing on his lips. He expected her to fail, to stumble over the unfamiliar symbols and retreat in embarrassment. He certainly didn't expect her to actually translate the inscription. Daria closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath to calm her racing heart. She had studied many languages, both living and dead, and she had a knack for deciphering patterns and recognizing linguistic structures. She opened her eyes and began to examine the tablet more closely, her fingers tracing the lines of the inscription. The symbols were unlike anything she had seen before, but as she looked closer, she began to see familiar shapes and patterns emerging from the chaos. She recognized the structure of a poem, the rhythmic flow of the words, the repetition of certain phrases. Slowly, painstakingly, Daria began to decipher the inscription. She worked in silence, oblivious to the curious stares of the scholars and the amused smirk of the prince. She translated word by word, line by line, piecing together the fragments of a forgotten language. As she worked, she began to understand the meaning of the inscription. It wasn't a royal decree or a historical record, as many had assumed. It was a love poem, a passionate declaration of affection written in a language that had been lost to time. The words spoke of longing and devotion, of the joy and pain of love, of the enduring power of the human heart. The more Daria translated, the more captivated she became. The poem was beautiful, its imagery vivid and evocative. It spoke of moonlit gardens and whispered promises, of stolen glances and lingering touches. It was a language of love that transcended time and culture, a language that resonated deep within her soul. As she reached the final lines, a small smile touched her lips. She had done it. She had translated the inscription, unlocking the secrets of the forgotten language and revealing the hidden heart of the ancient relic. She looked up at Prince Bashir, her eyes shining with a mixture of triumph and something else, something that even she couldn't quite name. Daria cleared her throat, the silence of the library amplifying the small sound. All eyes were on her, the scholars leaning forward in anticipation, Prince Bashir watching with an air of detached amusement. She held the clay tablet in her hands, the strange symbols now familiar to her, each one a brushstroke in a painting of words. She began to recite the poem, not in the common tongue of Bursa, but in the original language of the inscription, a language that had not been spoken for centuries. The sounds that flowed from her lips were melodic and strange, a language both ancient and new. Her voice, though soft, carried through the library, filling the vast space with the echoes of a forgotten time. The poem spoke of a love both passionate and tender, of a bond that defied the boundaries of time and space. It told of a prince who fell in love with a commoner, a woman whose beauty and spirit captivated his heart. It spoke of stolen moments and secret rendezvous, of whispered promises and lingering embraces. As Daria recited the poem, a hush fell over the library. The scholars, initially skeptical, were now captivated by the beauty of the language and the power of the words. Even Prince Bashir, who had expected nothing more than a stammering attempt at translation, found himself drawn into the story. He had studied countless ancient texts, but he had never encountered anything quite like this. The poem resonated with him on a level he couldn't quite explain. It spoke to something deep within his soul, something he had long kept hidden beneath layers of arrogance and pride. As Daria reached the final lines of the poem, her voice trembled with emotion. The words spoke of a love that transcended death itself, a love that would endure for all eternity. When she finished, a profound silence filled the library. The scholars were speechless, their faces etched with a mixture of awe and wonder, and then a single tear rolled down Prince Bashir's cheek. It traced a path through the carefully groomed beard he wore, a testament to the unexpected power of the poem. He quickly brushed it away, embarrassed by this display of emotion, but it was too late. The scholars had seen it, the undeniable evidence of the poem's impact. Daria, too, had seen it, and her heart skipped a beat. She had not only translated the inscription, but she had also touched the heart of the prince, a heart that had seemed impenetrable until now. Daria's duties in the library continued as before, dusting shelves, fetching books, and assisting the scholars. Yet everything felt different. The air crackled with an unspoken tension, a subtle shift in the atmosphere that only she and Prince Bashir seemed to notice. Whenever their paths crossed, their eyes would meet, and a silent conversation would pass between them. His gaze lingered a moment longer than before, a flicker of curiosity and perhaps something more in his dark eyes. Daria, in turn, found herself stealing glances at him when she thought he wasn't looking, admiring the way his brow furrowed in concentration as he studied ancient scrolls, or the way his lips curved into a rare smile when he deciphered a particularly challenging passage. The library, once a sanctuary of quiet study, now felt charged with a different kind of energy. The whispers in the stacks seemed to carry secrets, the rustle of turning pages like the beat of a shared heart. One afternoon, as Daria was reshelving a stack of books, Bashir approached her. He stood close, his presence filling the narrow aisle between the shelves. "You have a gift, Daria," he said, his voice low and serious, a stark contrast to his usual arrogance. "A true gift for languages." Daria blushed, her fingers fumbling with the books. "It is nothing, Your Highness," she murmured, her eyes fixed on the spines of the books. "It is not nothing," Bashir insisted. "It is rare to find someone with such an ear for language, such an intuitive grasp of its nuances." He paused, his eyes searching hers. "I would be honored if you would assist me with my research." Daria's heart leaped at his words. To assist the prince, to work alongside him in the pursuit of knowledge, was a dream she had never dared to imagine. "I would be honored, Your Highness," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. From that day forward, Daria and Bashir began to spend more time together. They would pore over ancient texts, debating the meaning of obscure passages and sharing their insights into forgotten languages. They would meet in quiet corners of the library, hidden amongst the towering shelves, their whispered conversations, a secret shared between them. Bashir, stripped of his usual arrogance, revealed a different side of himself to Daria. He spoke of his passion for knowledge, his desire to understand the world and its history. He confessed his frustration with the limitations of his own understanding, his yearning to unlock the secrets of the past. Daria, in turn, shared her own dreams and aspirations, her longing to become a scholar in her own right. She spoke of her love for the library, her fascination with words, her belief in the power of knowledge to transform lives. As they worked together, a bond formed between them, a connection that went beyond their shared passion for languages. They found solace in each other's company, a refuge from the pressures of their respective worlds. He, a prince burdened by expectations and responsibilities; she, a servant girl yearning for a life beyond the confines of her station. In the quiet corners of the library, surrounded by the whispers of ancient texts, they found a shared language, a language of understanding and respect, a language that hinted at something more profound. Professor Hikmet, Bashir's mentor and the chief scholar of the Bursa Library, watched the growing connection between the prince and Daria with a simmering resentment. He had nurtured Bashir's intellect since the prince was a boy, molding him into the brilliant linguist he had become. Hikmet saw Bashir as his greatest achievement, a testament to his own scholarly prowess. He had basked in the reflected glory of his pupil's accomplishments, his pride swelling with each new intellectual conquest. Daria's unexpected triumph with the ancient love poem had struck a blow to Hikmet's carefully constructed world. He had dismissed her as a mere servant, a girl unworthy of his attention, let alone a place among the scholars. Her success, her ability to decipher a text that had stumped him and the other scholars, was a direct challenge to his authority, a public humiliation he could not forgive. He saw her not as a bright young mind eager to learn, but as a threat, an upstart who dared to challenge the established order. Hikmet's pride, wounded and festering, turned into a bitter resentment. He couldn't bear the thought of a mere servant girl, a woman no less, surpassing his prized pupil. The whispers among the scholars, the subtle shift in Bashir's demeanor, the growing respect Daria commanded, it all fueled his anger. He vowed to put Daria in her place, to expose her as a fraud, to banish her from the library and erase her from Bashir's mind. He began to plot, his mind working with a cunning born of years of academic rivalry and intellectual combat. He would devise a series of tests, challenges so difficult, so obscure, that even the most seasoned scholars would struggle to complete them. He would present these challenges to Daria, disguised as opportunities to showcase her skills, to prove her worth. But they would be traps, carefully designed to expose her supposed ignorance and reveal her as a charlatan. He summoned her to his private study, a small, dimly lit room lined with shelves overflowing with books and scrolls. Daria entered nervously, her hands clasped before her. Hikmet sat behind a large, ornate desk, his face obscured by the shadows. He looked up at her, his eyes glinting with a cold fire. "Daria," he said, his voice smooth and deceptively gentle, "I have been impressed by your recent display of linguistic skill. It seems you possess a rare talent, one that should be nurtured and developed." He paused, a thin smile playing on his lips. "I have decided to offer you a series of challenges, a chance to prove your abilities and earn a place among the scholars of this library." He leaned forward, his voice hardening. "But be warned, these challenges will not be easy. Fail, and you will be banished from this library, your dreams of scholarship shattered forever." Hikmet's challenges began subtly. He presented Daria with ancient texts, faded and brittle, written in languages she had never encountered before. He gave her a limited time to translate them, watching her closely as she worked, his eyes searching for any sign of weakness or hesitation. Daria, eager to prove herself, threw herself into the tasks with fervor. She spent hours poring over the texts, deciphering unfamiliar scripts, painstakingly translating word by word. She consulted dusty grammars and lexicons, her fingers tracing the faded ink of long-forgotten scholars. To her surprise, she found she enjoyed the challenge. Each new text was a puzzle to be solved, a mystery to be unraveled. The more difficult the task, the more determined she became. She discovered a resilience within herself she hadn't known she possessed, a tenacity that pushed her to keep going even when her eyes ached and her mind felt weary. She completed each task, presenting Hikmet with her translations, her hands trembling slightly, her heart pounding in her chest. He would examine her work, his face impassive, offering neither praise nor criticism. He simply nodded curtly and presented her with the next challenge. The tasks became progressively harder. Hikmet delved into the deepest recesses of the library, unearthing texts so obscure, so fragmented, that even seasoned scholars would have balked at the prospect of translating them. He presented Daria with clay tablets covered in cryptic symbols, scrolls written in languages that had been dead for centuries, parchments so damaged by time and decay that they crumbled at the slightest touch. He demanded translations of poems written in dialects so rare they existed only in whispered legends, and interpretations of philosophical treatises so complex they defied conventional understanding. Daria began to feel the strain. The long hours, the constant pressure, the relentless barrage of impossible tasks began to take their toll. She found herself stealing moments of rest whenever she could, snatching naps in quiet corners of the library, her head resting on a stack of books. She ate her meals quickly, her mind still racing with the intricacies of the text she was working on. She dreamt of strange symbols and forgotten languages, her sleep filled with the whispers of ancient voices. Bashir watched from a distance, his heart torn between admiration and concern. He recognized the brilliance of Daria's mind, her unwavering dedication to the pursuit of knowledge. He also saw the toll that Hikmet's relentless challenges were taking on her. He wanted to intervene, to protect her from the old scholar's machinations, but he hesitated. He was still struggling with his own pride, his own reluctance to admit his admiration for a woman who had once been a mere servant. He told himself he was observing, assessing, waiting for the right moment to act. But deep down he knew he was afraid. Afraid of what he might discover about himself, afraid of the feelings that were stirring within him, feelings he had never allowed himself to acknowledge before. Daria felt the weight of the library pressing down on her, not the physical weight of the books and scrolls, but the weight of expectation, the weight of her ambition. Each day brought a new challenge from Professor Hikmet, each task more demanding than the last. She felt like a climber scaling a sheer cliff face, her fingers clinging precariously to the smallest holds, the wind whipping around her, threatening to pull her into the abyss. She loved the work, the thrill of deciphering ancient scripts, the satisfaction of unlocking the secrets of forgotten languages. But the constant pressure, the relentless scrutiny of Hikmet's gaze was beginning to wear her down. She felt a growing sense of isolation, a distance between herself and the other scholars. They watched her with a mixture of awe and suspicion, their whispers following her as she moved through the library. She was no longer just a servant girl, but she wasn't quite one of them either, caught in a precarious space between two worlds. And then there was Bashir. His presence in the library, once a source of anxiety, had become something else entirely. A stolen glance across the reading room, a shared smile over a particularly challenging passage, a brief conversation in a quiet corner amongst the stacks. These small moments had become the bright spots in her day, the fuel that kept her going. She found herself looking for him, her heart quickening when she saw his familiar crimson robe amongst the scholars. But his attitude was a puzzle she couldn't decipher. One moment, he seemed genuinely interested in her work, engaging her in lively discussions about ancient languages and forgotten civilizations. The next, he would withdraw, his demeanor cool and distant, his eyes guarded and unreadable. She couldn't tell if he admired her intellect or resented her success, if he saw her as a scholar or still just a servant girl. This uncertainty gnawed at her, adding another layer of complexity to the already daunting challenges she faced. She longed to talk to him, to understand the shifting currents of his emotions, but she hesitated. The difference in their social standing, the whispers and stares of the other scholars, the ever-present shadow of Hikmet's disapproval, all these factors held her back. Daria found herself caught in a dilemma. She yearned to pursue her dream of scholarship, to prove herself worthy of a place among the learned men of Bursa. But she also found herself increasingly drawn to Bashir, to the quiet moments of connection they shared, to the possibility of something more. How could she reconcile these two seemingly conflicting desires? How could she navigate the treacherous path before her, balancing her ambition with her heart, her desire for knowledge with her longing for love? The answer, she knew, lay somewhere within the whispers of the library, hidden amongst the ancient texts, waiting to be discovered, like a forgotten language waiting to be deciphered. Daria's fingers traced the worn leather of a crumbling manuscript, her brow furrowed in concentration. The script was ancient, the ink faded and barely legible. It was one of the texts Hikmet had given her to translate, another seemingly impossible challenge designed to test her limits. But something about this text felt different. There was a subtle inconsistency in the script, a slight variation in the form of certain characters that niggled at her mind. It was as if a discordant note had been struck in a familiar melody, a subtle but persistent dissonance that she couldn't ignore. She had noticed similar inconsistencies in other texts Hikmet had given her, small discrepancies that seemed to defy the established rules of the ancient language. At first, she had dismissed them as scribal errors, the inevitable mistakes that occurred when copying texts by hand. But the more she studied, the more she began to suspect that these were not mere errors, but deliberate alterations, subtle manipulations of the original text. A seed of suspicion began to grow in her mind, a suspicion that whispered in the quiet corners of the library, a suspicion that dared to question the authority of the esteemed Professor Hikmet. Could it be possible that he was not the infallible scholar everyone believed him to be? Could it be possible that he was a fraud? The thought was audacious, almost sacrilegious. Hikmet was a legend in the world of scholarship, his reputation beyond reproach. To question his integrity was to question the very foundations of the library itself, yet the inconsistencies she had observed, the nagging doubts that lingered in her mind, refused to be silenced. Daria began to investigate, her movements furtive and discreet. She spent her spare moments poring over other ancient texts, comparing the scripts, searching for similar discrepancies. She consulted with other scholars, engaging them in hushed conversations amongst the towering stacks, careful not to reveal her suspicions outright. She sought the advice of a wizened old librarian, a woman named Ilara, who had worked in the library for decades and possessed a vast knowledge of its hidden corners and forgotten secrets. Ilara listened patiently as Daria described her concerns, her voice barely above a whisper. She nodded slowly, her eyes twinkling with a knowing look. "Professor Hikmet is a brilliant scholar," she said, her voice low and measured, "but even the most brilliant minds can be tempted by pride and ambition." She paused, her gaze fixed on Daria. "Follow your instincts, child. The truth, like a hidden inscription, often reveals itself to those who seek it with an open heart and a discerning eye." Ilara's words gave Daria the courage she needed to continue her investigation. She began to focus her attention on the texts Hikmet had personally acquired for the library, the ones he claimed to have discovered in remote monasteries and forgotten ruins. She examined them with a newfound scrutiny, her eyes searching for the telltale signs of manipulation, the subtle clues that might reveal the truth. The library, once a sanctuary of knowledge, now felt like a labyrinth of secrets. Daria moved through its hallowed halls with a sense of purpose, her mind sharp and alert, her senses heightened. She felt like a detective unraveling a complex mystery, each new discovery bringing her closer to the truth, but also closer to a danger she couldn't quite define. The whispers in the stacks seemed to grow louder, the rustle of turning pages like the beating of a hidden heart, the air thick with anticipation. She knew she was treading on dangerous ground, but she couldn't turn back. She had to know the truth, no matter the cost. Daria's investigation continued, her search for the truth becoming a quiet obsession. She spent countless hours in the library, poring over ancient texts, comparing scripts, searching for any inconsistencies that might support her growing suspicions about Professor Hikmet. She felt like a weaver unraveling a tangled tapestry, painstakingly separating the threads, searching for the pattern hidden beneath the knots and snarls. Ilara, the wise old librarian, became her confidant. They met in secret, in hushed corners of the library, their conversations whispered amongst the towering shelves. Ilara shared her knowledge of the library's history, its hidden collections, its long-forgotten scandals. She told Daria stories of ambitious scholars, of rivalries and betrayals, of reputations built on lies and deceit. "Pride is a dangerous thing, child," Ilara warned, her voice low and grave. "It can blind even the most brilliant minds, leading them down a path of deception and ruin." She paused, her eyes twinkling with a knowing look. "Professor Hikmet has always been a proud man, jealous of his reputation, protective of his legacy." Ilara's words resonated with Daria. She had witnessed Hikmet's pride firsthand, his arrogance, his dismissive attitude towards anyone who dared to challenge his authority. She remembered the way he had looked at her when she had translated the ancient love poem, the flicker of resentment in his eyes, the subtle shift in his demeanor. She began to see his challenges, not as tests of her ability, but as attempts to discredit her, to undermine her growing reputation, to erase her from Bashir's mind. With Ilara's guidance, Daria began to focus her investigation on a specific collection of texts, a collection that Hikmet had personally acquired for the library. These texts, supposedly discovered in a remote monastery high in the mountains, were considered to be some of the most valuable and significant acquisitions in the library's history. They were written in a rare and ancient language, a language that Hikmet claimed only he could decipher. Daria examined these texts with a new intensity, her eyes searching for the subtle inconsistencies she had noticed in other texts. She compared the script with other known examples of the ancient language, looking for variations in the form of the characters, discrepancies in the grammatical structure, anything that might suggest manipulation or forgery. As she studied, a pattern began to emerge. She noticed that certain characters, particularly those representing complex grammatical structures, were subtly different from the established forms. These variations were so small, so subtle, that they would have been missed by anyone but the most discerning eye. But to Daria, they were like flashing beacons, illuminating a path of deception. She realized that Hikmet had not discovered these texts, but had created them. He had taken genuine ancient texts and subtly altered them, adding his own interpretations, inserting his own ideas, creating a false narrative that elevated his own scholarly reputation. He had woven a web of deceit, a tapestry of lies designed to fool everyone, including the prince. The realization sent a shiver down Daria's spine. She had uncovered a secret that could shatter Hikmet's reputation, a secret that could change the course of her own life. She knew she had to be careful, to proceed with caution. Hikmet was a powerful man, with influential friends and a reputation to protect. He would not hesitate to crush anyone who threatened his carefully constructed world. Daria looked around the library, at the towering shelves, the ancient texts, the scholars lost in their studies. She felt a sense of both excitement and trepidation. She had unraveled the deception, but the hardest part was yet to come. She had to expose the truth, but how? And what would the consequences be? The answers, she knew, lay somewhere within the whispers of the library, waiting to be discovered, like a hidden inscription waiting to be deciphered. Daria's heart pounded in her chest as she carefully unrolled a brittle scroll. This particular scroll, touted by Hikmet as a masterpiece of ancient philosophical thought, had been the focus of her investigation for weeks. It was written in a dialect so obscure, so rare, that Hikmet claimed to be the only scholar in Bursa capable of understanding it. He had used this scroll to bolster his reputation, citing its complex arguments in his lectures, quoting its wisdom in his writings. Daria, however, had discovered a small, almost imperceptible error within the script. A single character, repeated several times throughout the text, had been subtly altered. It was a tiny variation, a slight deviation from the established form, easily missed by an untrained eye. But to Daria, who had spent countless hours studying the nuances of the ancient language, it was a glaring anomaly. She had discovered a similar error in other texts Hikmet had discovered. Each time, the same character had been subtly altered, a consistent pattern of manipulation that pointed to a deliberate act of forgery. She realized that Hikmet had not discovered these texts, but had created them. He had taken genuine ancient scrolls and subtly altered them, inserting his own interpretations, weaving his own ideas into the fabric of the original text. This particular scroll, however, held a more significant secret. The altered character, when translated literally, held a different meaning than the one Hikmet had presented. Instead of representing a complex philosophical concept, as Hikmet had claimed, it represented a simple, almost childish word: mine. Daria's breath caught in her throat as the realization dawned on her. Hikmet hadn't just altered the text to enhance his reputation, he had altered it to claim ownership, to mark it as his own creation. The repeated use of the altered character, woven throughout the scroll, was not a scholarly flourish, but a confession, a subtle but undeniable admission of fraud. She reread the passage containing the altered character, translating it aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. The words, when read with the correct interpretation of the altered character, formed a simple, damning sentence. This wisdom, this knowledge, is mine. The sentence, repeated throughout the scroll, was not a declaration of intellectual mastery, but a boast, a whispered confession hidden in plain sight. Daria felt a surge of triumph, mixed with a chilling sense of unease. She had found the proof she needed, the undeniable evidence of Hikmet's deceit. The forged inscription, his pride and arrogance woven into its very fabric, was the key to unraveling his web of lies. She carefully rolled the scroll, her hands trembling slightly. She knew she held in her hands not just an ancient text, but a dangerous secret, a secret that could shatter Hikmet's carefully constructed world. The whispers of the library seemed to grow louder, the air thick with anticipation. The time had come to reveal the truth. Bashir found himself increasingly drawn to the quiet corners of the library, not to study ancient texts, but to observe Daria. He watched her as she worked, her brow furrowed in concentration, her fingers tracing the lines of faded scripts. He admired her tenacity, her unwavering dedication to the pursuit of knowledge, even in the face of Hikmet's relentless challenges. He had initially dismissed her correction of his pronunciation as the audacity of a servant girl, but now he recognized it as the insight of a keen mind, an ear attuned to the subtleties of language. He had witnessed her tireless efforts, the long hours she spent poring over ancient texts, the quiet determination with which she approached each new challenge. He had seen the weariness in her eyes, the strain of the constant pressure, but he had also seen the spark of excitement, the intellectual fire that burned within her. He began to question Hikmet's motives. The old scholar's challenges, initially presented as opportunities for Daria to showcase her skills, now seemed designed to break her, to crush her spirit. Bashir recalled Hikmet's thinly veiled resentment towards Daria, the subtle jabs and criticisms disguised as scholarly advice. He remembered the way Hikmet had dismissed Daria's insights, the way he had minimized her accomplishments, the way he had tried to erase her from the library and from Bashir's mind. Bashir's own arrogance began to crumble under the weight of his observations. He realized that his pride, his need to be the smartest, the most knowledgeable, had blinded him to the truth. He had been so focused on proving his own intellectual superiority that he had failed to recognize the brilliance of the young woman who stood before him. He had dismissed her as a servant, a woman beneath his notice, and in doing so he had limited himself, closing himself off from a world of knowledge and understanding that she held within her. He began to seek out Daria's company, not as a prince, but as a fellow scholar, eager to learn from her insights, to share his own struggles with the complexities of ancient languages. He found himself drawn to her quiet strength, her unwavering belief in the power of knowledge, her passion for the written word. He realized that her knowledge was not a threat to his own, but a complement, a different perspective that enriched his understanding of the world. A shift occurred within him, a subtle but profound awakening. He saw Daria not as a servant girl, not as a rival, but as an equal, a partner in the pursuit of knowledge, a kindred spirit who shared his love for the whispers of the library and the secrets held within its ancient texts. He began to understand that true wisdom lay not in arrogance and pride, but in humility and openness, in the willingness to learn from others, to embrace different perspectives, to acknowledge the limitations of one's own understanding. And in that awakening, he began to see not just the brilliance of Daria's mind, but the beauty of her spirit, the strength of her character, the depth of her heart. Daria stood before Professor Hikmet in the grand reading room of the library. The room was filled with scholars, their hushed whispers echoing amongst the towering shelves. Bashir stood near the back, his expression unreadable. Daria held the forged scroll in her hands, its brittle edges crumbling slightly. She took a deep breath and began to speak, her voice clear and steady. "Professor Hikmet," she said, "I have been studying the ancient texts you brought to this library, the texts you claim to have discovered in remote monasteries and forgotten ruins." She paused, her gaze sweeping across the assembled scholars. "I have discovered something unsettling." Hikmet's face paled slightly, but he maintained a facade of composure. "And what, pray tell, have you discovered?" he asked, his voice laced with a hint of condescension. Daria held up the scroll. "This scroll, Professor, is not what it seems. It is not a masterpiece of ancient philosophical thought, as you have claimed. It is a forgery." A gasp rippled through the room. The scholars murmured amongst themselves, their eyes darting between Daria and Hikmet. Bashir stepped forward, his expression now one of intense interest. "Explain yourself, Daria," he said, his voice calm but firm. Daria pointed to a specific character in the scroll. "This character, Your Highness, has been subtly altered. It is a small change, easily missed, but significant nonetheless." She explained the true meaning of the altered character, how it represented a simple word of possession, mine. She then read aloud the sentence formed by the altered character, the sentence that revealed Hikmet's deceit. "This wisdom, this knowledge, is mine." This sentence, repeated throughout the scroll, Daria continued, is not a declaration of intellectual mastery, but a confession of forgery. The room fell silent. The scholars stared at Hikmet, their faces a mixture of shock and disbelief. Hikmet's composure finally cracked. His face flushed crimson, his hands clenched into fists. "Lies," he sputtered. "This girl is a liar. She's trying to discredit me, to steal my reputation." Daria met his gaze unflinchingly. "I have proof," she said, her voice steady. She then presented the other text she had examined, pointing out the same altered character in each one, the same pattern of manipulation. She explained how Hikmet had taken genuine ancient texts and subtly altered them, inserting his own interpretations, weaving his own ideas into the fabric of the original text. "You have used these forgeries to enhance your reputation," she said, her voice rising slightly, "to deceive the scholars of this library, to mislead the prince himself." Bashir stepped forward, his eyes fixed on Hikmet. He had watched Daria's presentation with growing unease, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place in his mind. He remembered his own arrogance, his initial dismissal of Daria's abilities, his blind faith in his mentor's wisdom. He realized now how easily he had been deceived, how readily he had accepted Hikmet's pronouncements without question. "Professor Hikmet," Bashir said, his voice low and dangerous, "is this true?" Hikmet, cornered and exposed, could no longer maintain his facade of innocence. He looked at Bashir, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and resentment. I only wanted to," he stammered, his voice trailing off. He knew he was defeated. His carefully constructed world, built on lies and deceit, had crumbled around him. The whispers of the library, once hushed and reverent, now echoed with accusations and condemnation. The scholars, once his admirers, now stared at him with contempt and disgust, and Bashir, his prized pupil, the source of his greatest pride, now looked at him with a mixture of disappointment and betrayal. Bashir's voice, though quiet, resonated with authority. "Professor Hikmet, your deceit has been exposed. You have betrayed the trust of this library, the trust of the scholars, and my trust." He turned to address the assembled scholars. "Professor Hikmet's position as chief scholar is hereby revoked. He is banished from this library, and his fraudulent works will be removed from our collection." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. The scholars, freed from the shadow of Hikmet's authority, began to speak amongst themselves, their voices rising in a chorus of condemnation. Some expressed outrage at his betrayal, others a quiet satisfaction at his downfall. A few, perhaps remembering past slights and humiliations, openly rejoiced at his comeuppance. Hikmet stood in stunned silence, his face ashen, his eyes darting nervously around the room. The weight of his deceit, the weight of his pride, pressed down on him, crushing him beneath its burden. He had spent years building his reputation, crafting his image as a brilliant scholar, a wise mentor, a guardian of ancient knowledge. Now, in a matter of minutes, it had all come crashing down. His legacy, once a source of pride, was now tarnished, irrevocably stained by the mark of forgery. He opened his mouth to speak, to defend himself, to offer some explanation, some justification for his actions, but the words wouldn't come. The truth, stark and undeniable, hung in the air, silencing any attempt at denial or deception. He looked at Bashir, hoping for some sign of leniency, some flicker of the respect and admiration he had once enjoyed. But Bashir's gaze was cold and unforgiving. The bond between mentor and pupil, once so strong, had been severed, broken by the weight of Hikmet's betrayal. Hikmet turned and walked slowly towards the library doors, his steps heavy, his shoulders slumped. The whispers of the scholars followed him, a chorus of condemnation that echoed in his ears. He passed by Daria. Their eyes met for a brief moment. He saw not triumph in her gaze, but a quiet sadness, a hint of regret. He realized then that she had not sought to destroy him, but to expose the truth, to protect the integrity of the library, the sanctity of knowledge. As he reached the doors, he paused, looking back at the library, at the towering shelves, the ancient texts, the scholars who had once been his colleagues, his admirers. He felt a pang of loss, a deep and abiding regret. He had sacrificed everything, his reputation, his career, his relationships, for the fleeting satisfaction of his pride, the empty glory of a fabricated legacy. He had betrayed the very thing he claimed to cherish most, the pursuit of knowledge, the search for truth. He pushed open the heavy doors and stepped out into the bright sunlight, leaving behind the whispers of the library, the echoes of his downfall, the ruins of his carefully constructed world. The silence in the library, after Hikmet's departure, was thick and heavy. The scholars whispered amongst themselves, their voices hushed with a mixture of shock and relief. Daria stood quietly, the forged scroll still clutched in her hand, the weight of the revelation settling upon her. She felt a sense of satisfaction, of having done the right thing, but also a tinge of sadness for the fallen scholar. Bashir approached her. His expression softened, the arrogance that had once characterized him replaced by a quiet humility. He looked at her, his dark eyes searching hers. "Daria," he said, his voice low and sincere, "I owe you an apology." Daria looked up at him, surprised by his words. "Your Highness?" "I misjudged you," Bashir continued. "I allowed my pride, my arrogance to blind me to your intelligence, your integrity, your courage." He paused, his gaze fixed on hers. "I mocked you. I underestimated you, and I am deeply ashamed of my behavior." Daria's heart softened at his words. She had expected anger, perhaps even resentment, but not this genuine expression of remorse. "Your Highness, there is no need," she began, but he cut her off. "There is every need," Bashir insisted. "I treated you with disrespect, with disdain, and you responded with grace, with intelligence, with unwavering dedication to the truth." He reached out and gently took her hand, his touch sending a warm shiver down her spine. "You have shown me the folly of my pride, the limitations of my own understanding." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a newfound respect. "You have taught me a valuable lesson, Daria, a lesson I will never forget." He paused, then continued, his voice now filled with a quiet intensity. "I have a proposal for you, Daria. I am embarking on a project to reform our kingdom's education system. I want to make knowledge accessible to all, regardless of their social standing, their gender, their background. I want to create schools where everyone, men and women alike, can learn to read, to write, to explore the wonders of the world through the power of knowledge." He looked at her, his eyes shining with a passionate conviction. "I need your help, Daria, your intelligence, your passion for learning, your unwavering commitment to the truth. These are the qualities I need to make this vision a reality. Will you join me?" Daria's heart soared at his words. This was more than she had ever dreamed of, a chance not just to pursue her own scholarship, but to shape the future of her kingdom, to empower others with the gift of knowledge. She looked at Bashir, at the man who had once mocked her, who had underestimated her, who had now become her champion, her partner in the pursuit of a shared dream. She knew, without a doubt, that she had found her place, not just in the library, but in the world. Daria smiled, a radiant smile that lit up the grand reading room of the library. "Your Highness," she said, her voice filled with a quiet confidence, "I accept your proposal, on one condition." Bashir raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "And what is that condition, Daria?" "That I remain a free scholar," she replied, her gaze steady. "That I am not bound by titles or expectations, that I am free to pursue my own research, to explore my own interests, to follow the path of knowledge wherever it may lead." Bashir smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. "Agreed," he said, his voice filled with respect. "You will remain a free scholar, Daria, free to pursue your own path, free to share your wisdom with the world." No, he took her hand again, his touch warm and reassuring. "Together, we will transform this kingdom, one book, one school, one mind at a time." And so, Daria and Bashir began their work. They married, not as a prince and a servant, but as equals, as partners in the pursuit of knowledge and the advancement of learning. They traveled throughout the kingdom, visiting remote villages and bustling cities, establishing schools and libraries, making education accessible to all. Daria, no longer a mere servant, became a renowned scholar, her expertise in ancient languages sought after by scholars from far and wide. She continued to translate ancient texts, uncovering lost histories and forgotten wisdom. She wrote books and gave lectures, sharing her knowledge with eager students, inspiring a new generation of scholars. She remained true to her condition, pursuing her own research, exploring her own interests, following the path of knowledge wherever it may lead. Bashir, humbled by Daria's wisdom and inspired by her passion, became a wise and just ruler. He supported Daria's work, providing resources and encouragement, ensuring that her vision for a more educated kingdom became a reality. He learned from her, he respected her, he cherished her, not as a possession but as a partner, a confidant, a friend. Together, they transformed the kingdom of Bursa. They opened schools that welcomed both men and women, rich and poor, offering everyone the opportunity to learn and grow. They established libraries in every town and village, filling them with books and scrolls, making knowledge accessible to all. They fostered a culture of learning, a love of knowledge, a respect for wisdom. Years later, Daria and Bashir sat together in a quiet corner of the Grand Library of Bursa, surrounded by the familiar whispers of turning pages. The sunlight streamed through the high, arched windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. They were older now, their hair streaked with silver, their faces etched with the wisdom of years. But their eyes still shone with the same passion for knowledge, the same love for the written word. Daria held a newly translated scroll in her hands, its ancient script revealing the secrets of a long-lost civilization. She looked at Bashir, her eyes twinkling with excitement. "Listen to this, my love," she said, and she began to read, her voice soft and melodic, the words of the ancient text filling the library with the echoes of a forgotten time. Bashir listened intently, his hand resting on hers, their fingers intertwined, their hearts united by a shared love for the whispers of the library and the enduring power of knowledge. And in that moment, surrounded by the books and scrolls that had brought them together, they knew that their love story, like the ancient texts they cherished, would endure for all time.